I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but then again, what could possibly be more important than family? The voice on the phone was my sister, Serafina, her tone a syrupy sweet concoction of condescension and feigned concern. It was 3 in the morning in my Berlin lab. The only light came from the cool blue glow of 3 monitors, where a complex neural network was blossoming under my fingertips. I had been on the verge of a breakthrough, a moment of pure, unadulterated intellectual joy. Now that delicate thread of thought was gone, shattered by the sound of her voice. "Sarah, it's the middle of the night here. Is everything okay?" I asked, leaning back in my chair, the chill of the leather seeping through my sweater. A familiar knot of dread tightened in my stomach. "Oh, it's more than okay, Jen. It's wonderful," she chirped. "I have the best news. You know that whole tiresome business with the house? Well, you don't have to worry your brilliant little head about it anymore. I've solved everything." The house, our parents' house. After our father passed, it had become a quiet battleground. I saw it as a sanctuary for his memory, his library a sacred space. Sarah and her husband, Julian, saw it only as a line item on a balance sheet. "What do you mean you've solved it?" My voice was barely a whisper. "I sold it," she declared, as if she'd just won the lottery. The deal closed this afternoon. We got a fantastic cash offer, $900,000. The money should be wired within the week. Isn't it a relief to finally put all that behind us? The number was a punch to the gut, $900,000, for a home and property easily worth $4 million. My mind, trained to find flaws in code, saw a fatal error in her logic, in her very being. "Sarah, you can't have," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The hum of the servers suddenly felt deafening. "It's in both our names. A sale requires my signature. I haven't signed anything." A short, brittle laugh echoed down the line, a sound as sharp as breaking glass. "Honestly, Genesis, you're always so stuck on the minor details. Don't you remember that paper you signed before you jetted off to Europe? The power of attorney for medical emergencies." Well, Julian's lawyer took a look, and it turns out it's good for financial emergencies, too. And this was an emergency. I felt the blood drain from my face. The document. I remembered signing it in a blur at the airport curb, Sarah tapping her foot impatiently. "It's just a formality, Jen, in case something happens." I had trusted her. In one moment of familial weakness, I had forgotten a lifetime of evidence to the contrary, and I had trusted her. "What emergency?" I asked, my voice flat. "Julian has this incredible investment opportunity, a luxury real estate development. It's going to set us up for life. We had to act fast," she explained, her voice dropping as if sharing a delightful secret. "This is for the family's future, Genesis. While you're off in your own world, playing with your algorithms, someone has to be here, in the real world, shouldering the actual responsibilities." Playing with my algorithms. There it was again. The casual dismissal of my life's work. The years of sacrifice, of living on ramen and sheer grit. Of earning scholarships so I wouldn't be a burden. Of building a career that my father had been so proud of. All of it reduced to a child's game. A silent, volcanic anger began to build inside me, but my voice, when I finally found it, was unnervingly calm. The emotional circuits had fused, leaving only the cold, hard logic of the processor. The problem was no longer an abstract loop in a machine. The problem was my sister. "I understand," I said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silence. "Good. I knew you would," she said, her relief palpable. "Look, I have to run. Julian is taking me out for a celebratory dinner." We'll talk soon. The line went dead. I sat motionless in the blue glow of my monitors, the hum of the machines a steady, indifferent witness. She thought she had won. She thought I was a harmless eccentric, thousands of miles away, too lost in my own world to fight back. She had forgotten who I was. I was the daughter of a history professor, a man who taught me that the past is never truly gone, and that every action has consequences. My fingers, steady now, moved over the keyboard. I saved my work and closed the program. The breakthrough could wait. A new, more urgent problem required a solution. I opened a new browser tab. The search query was simple, direct, and final. Berlin to Los Angeles, one way. The roar of the engines was a fitting soundtrack for the storm brewing inside me. On a plane, you are nowhere, suspended between a past you've just left and a future you're hurtling toward. For me, that past was a lifetime of carefully managed expectations and quiet heartbreaks, and the future was a battlefield I had not chosen, but would not, could not lose. As the coast of Europe disappeared beneath the clouds, my mind, unbidden, began to sift through the wreckage of my memory, searching for the first cracks in the foundation, the moments that had led inexorably to that midnight phone call. My college graduation party came back to me with the clarity of a photograph. It was a perfect Pasadena afternoon, the sun warming the flagstones of the patio, the air thick with the scent of my mother's prize-winning roses and jasmine. I had just graduated, not just with honors, but as valedictorian of the computer science department, the first woman in the university's history to do so. My father, Richard, was practically bursting with pride. He was a quiet man, a history professor who saw the world in long, sweeping arcs of cause and effect. And in my work, he saw the future. He followed me around the party, a glass of champagne in hand, telling anyone who would listen about my senior thesis, an early-stage AI I had designed to predict patterns in historical data. "She's built a digital oracle, can you believe it?" he'd say, his eyes shining. "It's groundbreaking." I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a rare and precious feeling of being truly seen. But then my mother would glide over, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. With a delicate touch on my father's arm, she would steer the conversation away. "Richard, darling, don't bore our guests with all that technical jargon." Then, turning to the small crowd, she would raise her voice just enough to be heard over the murmur of conversation. "But we're so proud of both our girls. Serafina, my little artist, just had her first gallery show." All eyes would shift to my sister, who stood radiant in a designer dress, accepting congratulations for a modest exhibition of her watercolors at a small, local gallery. The focus of the party, my graduation party, pivoted on a dime. My groundbreaking thesis was reduced to technical jargon, while Sarah's pretty landscapes became the main event. My mother's masterstroke was a line she repeated throughout the day, a sentence that was both a compliment and a cage. "Serafina is the artist in the family, so full of heart," she would say, patting my arm. "And Genesis, well, she has her father's brain." She made it sound like a consolation prize, a quirky, unfeminine trait that couldn't possibly compete with the romantic ideal of an artist. I stood there, my valedictorian medal, feeling heavy and pointless under my dress, and I became invisible in my own celebration. I smiled, I nodded, I accepted the polite handshakes, but inside, the pride I had felt just moments before had curdled into a familiar, lonely ache. That ache returned, sharper and more profound, the day we buried my father. After the service, While guests offered condolences in the living room, I sought refuge in his library. The room was the heart of the house, the heart of our family, lined from floor to ceiling with the books that were his life's passion. The air still smelled of him, old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. I ran my fingers along the spines of his favorite volumes, my grief a silent physical weight in my chest. This was his legacy, a world of thought and knowledge he had passed on to me. The library door creaked open. It was Sarah, with Julian hovering behind her, his eyes already scanning the room with a disturbing, appraising gleam. "Are you just going to sit in here all day?" Sarah asked, her voice impatient. She wasn't grieving, she was restless. I looked at her, unable to form words. Julian stepped forward, placing a hand on the back of an antique leather armchair. "Your father had incredible taste," he said, his tone more like an auctioneer than a son-in-law. "This chair alone is probably worth a few thousand. We should have someone come in and appraise all this, the book collection, the antiques." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Exactly. There's no point in all this stuff just sitting here collecting dust. And the funeral was ridiculously expensive. Honestly, Dad should have planned better." A cold fury, so pure and potent it almost made me dizzy, rose up inside me. I looked from the priceless collection of human history on the shelves to the two of them, who could only see price tags. They were talking about liquidating my father's soul before his body was even cold in the ground. Julian's final comment was the one that sealed him in my mind as a ghoul. He looked around the beautiful, hallowed room and said, "At least the house is worth a fortune. That's the real asset here." I didn't say a word. I just sat there, clutching a leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius, and watched them. I watched them see a building while I saw a home. I watched them see assets while I saw a legacy. And on the plane, soaring 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, I finally understood. The phone call wasn't a beginning, it was an end. It was the final, predictable move. In a game they had been playing my entire life. They hadn't just sold a house, they had tried to sell my past, my memories, my father's very essence. And for that, there would be a reckoning. The hurt that had defined me for so long was crystallizing, hardening into something else entirely. It was becoming a weapon. The cold resolve I felt on the plane wasn't born in an instant. It was forged over years, in the quiet crucibles of lonely nights and stark, deliberate choices. Leaving my parents' house after my father's funeral wasn't a dramatic, door-slamming exit. It was a quiet, necessary amputation. To stay under my mother's roof, to exist in Seraphina's golden shadow, was to accept a slow, certain death of the self. My mother called me a week after I'd moved into a dorm room that was little more than a painted cinder block cell. My meager savings almost entirely depleted by the security deposit. Her voice, smooth and honeyed, dripped with a concern that couldn't quite mask the steel of her disapproval. "Genesis, darling, this is simply absurd. Julian has been kind enough to find a lovely position for you in the marketing department of a friend's architectural firm. It's respectable. You could live at home, save your money. Why must you insist on the struggle?" Struggle, that's what she called it. I called it breathing. I pictured the job she described: a stylish office, a decent salary, a life of comfortable, soul-crushing mediocrity. A gilded cage where I'd be praised for my organizational skills, and my ideas would be gently dismissed as too technical. A life where I would forever be a quirky footnote in the grand, glossy story of the family. "Thank you, Mom, but I'm happy where I am," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I was free. The line went cold with her disappointment, and the unspoken message was clear: I was on my own. So I embraced the struggle. My life became a meticulously balanced equation of survival and ambition. My days began at 5 a.m. in the campus coffee shop, the hiss of the espresso machine and the smell of burnt coffee beans becoming the soundtrack to my mornings. I learned the muscle memory of it all: frothing milk, grinding beans, counting back change, while my mind was a million miles away, wrestling with complex algorithms from my advanced mathematics classes. My hands would be working, but my brain would be soaring. Those $8 an hour shifts, punctuated by the occasional condescending student complaining about their latte, were what paid for the instant noodles I ate for dinner, the used textbooks with passages highlighted by strangers, and the electricity that powered my old, wheezing laptop. The social life of a typical college student was a foreign country to me. I saw girls from my classes heading out to parties, their laughter echoing in the hallways, while I made my way to the library's silent, fluorescent-lit basement. Loneliness was a constant companion, a dull ache in my chest. There were times I'd scroll through social media and see a picture of Serafina on a weekend trip to Napa, or on a yacht in the marina, a glass of champagne in her hand, the caption something breezy about living her best life. And there I'd be, under the harsh library lights, with a mountain of coursework and a freelance coding project due at dawn. The injustice of it was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it. Her life was given to her, mine I was building from scratch. After my classes, my real work began. I took on freelance coding jobs, finding clients on obscure online forums that felt like digital back alleys. I became a ghost in the machine, a nameless problem solver for hire. The projects were grueling and anonymous. I debugged clunky inventory software for a hardware store in Iowa. I built a simple, clean website for a dog groomer in Florida. My most memorable battle was with the patient scheduling system for a dental practice in Ohio. Their old code was a tangled mess, a nightmare of contradictions that was causing them to lose appointments and double book patients. The owner, a man named Dr. Miller, was in a quiet panic. For 3 straight days, I barely slept. I lived on vending machine coffee and stale crackers, my world shrinking to the thousands of lines of faulty code on my screen. I untangled the mess, line by painstaking line, finding the logical fallacies, the broken loops, the lazy shortcuts the original programmer had taken. On the 3rd night, at around 4 a.m., I found the final critical error. My fingers flew across the keyboard, writing a new, elegant patch. I compiled it, ran the simulation, and it worked perfectly. A wave of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated triumph washed over me. The next morning, a frantic, grateful email from Dr. Miller was in my inbox, and $500 was in my PayPal account. It might as well have been $1 million. It was my money, earned not through charm or connections, but through sheer competence and relentless effort. But the grind took its toll. There was one winter night, huddled in my thin dorm blanket, when I hit a wall. I had a fever, a project was late, and I had 2 exams the next day. I felt a profound sense of despair wash over me. I was exhausted, bone-deep tired of being broke and alone. The easy life my mother had offered, the life of comfort and approval, felt seductively close. For a fleeting, desperate moment, I thought about quitting. Instead, I got angry, an anger so cold and clear, it burned away the feverish haze. I was angry at them for thinking so little of me, for believing I would break. That anger became fuel. I channeled all of it, all the frustration and loneliness and sleepless nights, into a personal project. It was an act of defiance. I started building the AI, the one I had dreamed of with my father, the one designed not just to find patterns, but to understand context. It became my singular obsession. In my final year, I poured everything I had into it and submitted the project with my application for the prestigious Atherton Grant, a full-ride scholarship for a master's program at a top-tier university. I didn't tell my family. I didn't want their skepticism or their false, brittle encouragement. I sent it out into the world like a prayer. Weeks later, I was summoned to the office of Professor Alistair Finch, the head of the department. He was a titan in the field, a contemporary of my father's, and a man whose intellect I deeply admired. His office was a chaotic sanctuary, smelling faintly of old paper and Earl Grey tea, so much like my father's library that it made my heart ache. He sat behind a mountain of a desk, my project proposal in his hand. "Genesis," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I've been on the Atherton selection board for 20 years. I've read thousands of proposals. Most are competent, some are ambitious." He tapped my paper. This is something else entirely. This recursive function you designed to handle ambiguous language inputs. It's not just efficient, it's poetic." I stared at him, my throat tight. He wasn't just praising the result. He saw the artistry in the code itself, the beauty I thought only I could see. He leaned forward, his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, searching mine. "I read your personal statement. You did this while working 30 hours a week. You built this engine with practically no resources." He shook his head slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. "Your father, Richard, was a colleague of mine, a good man. He always said history and technology were two sides of the same coin, humanity's attempt to understand itself. He would be immensely proud of this." He paused, then said the words that repaired years of damage. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that this work is a game, young lady. It's important. It's a gift." Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back burned at the corners of my eyes. He saw me, not as the girl with her father's brain, but as myself. When the official letter arrived confirming I had won the grant, it felt like more than a scholarship. It was a verdict. It was the world, in the form of a man my father had respected, telling me that I was on the right path. That quiet confidence, forged in the fires of my so-called struggle, was now a shield. And on the plane, hurtling toward a confrontation, I knew it would also be my sword. My family thought they were dealing with the quiet, awkward girl they had always dismissed. They were about to meet the woman she had been forced to become. The address Serafina's betrayal had forced me to find was in a part of downtown Los Angeles that felt like a relic from a different era. The law offices of Vance, Covington, and Finch were housed in a building of granite and dark marble, a stoic old sentinel standing watch over a city obsessed with the new and the fleeting. It was the kind of place where deals were sealed with a handshake and a man's word still meant something. It was my father's world. As I stepped into the hushed, wood-paneled lobby, the air itself seemed different, cool and still, smelling faintly of leather, wood polish, and old paper. A grandfather clock ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm in the corner, a sound that was both calming and a reminder that time was running out. A secretary who looked like she'd been there since the Eisenhower administration led me down a quiet hall to the corner office. "Mr. Vance will see you now," she said, her voice a respectful whisper. Arthur Vance rose from behind a vast mahogany desk as I entered. He was a man in his late 70s, tall and impeccably dressed, in a gray suit that was classic, not old-fashioned. His hair was a shock of distinguished white, and his eyes, behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, were sharp, intelligent, and kind. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by very little. "Genesis," he said, his voice a warm baritone. He came around the desk and took my hand in a firm, dry grip. "It is good to see you, my dear, though I wish it were under better circumstances. You look so much like your father." He gestured to one of the deep leather armchairs facing his desk. I sat, my bag clutched in my lap, feeling small and out of place, amidst the towering walls of leather-bound law books. For a moment I was overwhelmed, the little girl again in the presence of a grown-up. Then I remembered why I was there. The anger returned, a welcome and clarifying heat. I laid out the facts of Seraphina's phone call and the sale of the house, my voice even and precise, recounting the events as if I were presenting a data summary, stripping them of the raw, ragged emotion that churned just beneath the surface. Arthur listened patiently, his hands steepled on the desk, his gaze never leaving my face. He didn't interrupt, didn't show a flicker of shock or surprise. When I finished, a heavy silence settled in the room, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the clock. "I am not surprised, Genesis," he said finally, his voice laced with a deep, weary sadness. "I am only profoundly sorry that it has come to this. Your father, he was a brilliant man, but he was not blind." He leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "He always knew. He once told me right here in this office that Seraphina had your mother's heart, charming and ambitious, for better or for worse. But you—" Arthur's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a reflection of the validation I had spent my entire life craving. "You," he said, "had his mind, and more importantly, his integrity." He knew that was the rarer and more valuable gift. A lump formed in my throat. In one sentence, Arthur had given voice to the fundamental truth of my life, a truth my father had seen, even if he couldn't always say it aloud. "But Mr. Vance," I began, my voice wavering slightly, "the power of attorney. If what she did was legal, I don't know what I can do. The house—" "Genesis," he interrupted gently, holding up a hand. "We are not here today to talk about saving your father's house. We are here to talk about saving his life's work. And I do not mean his academic papers." He rose from his chair and walked over to a large, ornate cabinet built into the wall. Using a small brass key, he unlocked it, revealing not files, but a large, heavy-looking safe. He spun the dial with a practiced ease, and the thick steel door swung open with a quiet, satisfying thud. From within, he withdrew a thick, leather-bound portfolio and placed it on the polished surface of his desk between us. It was embossed with a single elegant letter, my father's initial R. "Your father was a history professor," Arthur said, his voice taking on a new, more serious tone. "It was his profession and his public passion, but he had a private passion as well, an intellectual hobby, you might call it. Your father, the man who could trace the fall of empires and the shifting tides of civilization, saw patterns everywhere, not just in the past, but in the future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "He was one of the most brilliant and disciplined investors I have ever known." I stared at him, uncomprehending. My father, the quiet, tweed-wearing academic who complained about the price of new hardcovers? It didn't make sense. Arthur opened the portfolio. He didn't trust brokers. He didn't trust the noise of the market. He trusted his research. He started in the late 80s with his inheritance from your grandfather. He invested in a tiny software company in Seattle. because he had read their technical manuals and believed in their vision for personal computing. He bought vast tracts of land in what were then barren parts of Texas and Arizona because his historical research predicted future population shifts. He was a founding silent partner in a small biotech firm because he understood the long-term arc of medical innovation. He began to lay documents out on the desk, his movements deliberate, stock certificates for companies that were now household names, deeds for commercial properties in cities across the country, statements from private wealth management accounts in Switzerland. Each document was a thunderclap, dismantling the reality I thought I knew. The house, he continued, was never just a house. That's why he was so adamant it never be sold. Your father was a man of letters, Genesis. Where else would he hide his fortress but in plain sight, behind a wall of books? My mind raced, jumping to the one place in the world that had always been my sanctuary. The library. Precisely, Arthur nodded. Behind the complete works of Shakespeare on the west wall, to be exact. He designed it himself. A temperature-controlled, fireproof vault. Inside that vault are the physical keys, the bearer bonds, the hard copies of every document, every password, every access code to his entire financial empire. My head was spinning. The betrayal, the frantic flight, the desperate hope of just saving my childhood home. It all seemed so small now, so naive. I had been fighting over a single tree, not realizing it was the key to a hidden forest. What is it all worth? I managed to ask, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Arthur Vance looked down at the final page in the portfolio, a neatly typed summary. He looked up, his expression sober. He structured everything through a series of trusts and holding companies to minimize tax and maximize privacy. By my last quarterly accounting, the entire estate is valued at a little over $87 million. The number didn't compute. It was an abstraction, a string of digits with no connection to the real world. 87 million. My sister had sold the key to a fortune for less than pocket change. The sheer, breathtaking ignorance of her greed was almost comical. Then Arthur delivered the final, devastating blow. "It is all held in a single, irrevocable trust," he said, turning the portfolio so I could see the title page. "The Richard C. Albright Legacy Trust. Your father was a very patient and methodical man. He wrote the terms himself with my help years ago. He stipulated that the trust's sole beneficiary and trustee would be you, and you alone. He let that sink in before continuing. But control would only pass to you under two conditions. First, that you had reached the age of 30. Second, that you had established a successful, independent life and career entirely on your own merits, without significant financial support from the family. He wanted to be certain you had the maturity and the strength of character to manage what he had built. He gave me a small, proud smile. Your research position in Berlin, the Atherton Grant. He would have considered that proof of concept, my dear. You have met the conditions." Tears I hadn't realized were forming began to blur the documents on the desk. It wasn't the money. It was the breathtaking, staggering faith he'd had in me. All those years I'd felt unseen, he had been watching. All those years I thought I was struggling alone. He had been building a fortress for me, believing I would one day be strong enough to command it. The struggle he'd allowed me to endure wasn't neglect. It was his final, greatest lesson. "And Serafina," I whispered. "Your father was not a cruel man," Arthur said. "He provided for her. The trust is mandated to pay her an annual stipend of $50,000 for the rest of her life. Enough to live comfortably, but not enough, as he put it, to fund a life of ambitious foolishness. A checkmate. From beyond the grave, my quiet, academic father had seen everything, planned for everything, and protected me in the only way he knew how. The shock began to recede, and in its place, a cold, diamond-hard clarity took hold. The hurt and confusion were gone, burned away by the incandescent light of this new reality. My objective was no longer simply to stop my sister. It was to honor my father. I was not a victim seeking justice anymore. I was the guardian of a legacy, the executor of my father's final brilliant plan. I looked up at Arthur Vance, the tears now dry on my face, and my voice, when I spoke, was as calm and steady as the ticking of the clock. "What," I asked, "is our first move?" I left Arthur Vance's office and checked into a sterile, anonymous hotel room downtown. The city of my childhood sprawled out below my window, a familiar landscape that now felt alien, a map to a country I no longer recognized. For the next 24 hours, Arthur and his team worked with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a special forces unit. Injunctions were filed, affidavits were signed, and a strategy was meticulously laid out. My role was simple: stay quiet and wait for the right moment. But as the hours ticked by, a sliver of the old Genesis began to surface, a faint echo of the girl who had always craved one thing above all else: peace within the family. My father's plan was a fortress, but it was also a declaration of war. A part of me, a foolish, sentimental part I thought had died on the flight over, felt a pang of sorrow for the final, irreparable severing of a bond, however toxic it had become. I wondered if there was another way, a path that didn't lead to total annihilation. Driven by this last flicker of a dying hope, I picked up the hotel phone and dialed Sarah's number. I told myself it was a final courtesy, a chance for her to stop this before it went too far. In my heart, I knew I was giving her one last test, a final opportunity to prove my father and my entire life's experience wrong. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and breathless. "Genesis, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Did the wire transfer go through? Julian is already drawing up plans." "Sarah, stop," I said, my voice low and even. "Stop everything. I'm asking you to call off the sale. Call the buyers, give them their deposit back, whatever it takes. Just stop." A short, incredulous laugh came through the phone. "Call it off. Are you insane? The papers are signed. The deal is done. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. What is your problem?" "My problem is that you had no right," I said, my voice hardening. "That house is half mine. More than that, it was Dad's. You can't just sell it for scrap." "Oh, here we go again," she sighed, the martyrdom in her tone, thick enough to cut with a knife. Poor sentimental Genesis, always clinging to the past. While you were off living your little academic dream, I was the one here, dealing with the estate, with Mom, with everything. This isn't about scrap. It's about building a future, something you wouldn't understand. "What I understand," I said, my patience shredding with every word, "is that you are about to make a catastrophic mistake. I'm giving you a chance, right now, to undo it." That's when her voice changed, shifting from condescending to venomous. "A chance? You're giving me a chance?" "Let me tell you something, Genesis. You're jealous. You've always been jealous. You hid in your books because you couldn't compete with me in the real world. And now that Julian and I are about to become seriously successful, you can't stand it. You want to sabotage us." The accusation was so wildly off the mark, so perfectly reflective of her own transactional view of the world, that it left me speechless for a beat. She took my silence as an admission of guilt and pressed her advantage. Dad was the same way, you know. He was brilliant, I guess, but he had no ambition, no vision. He was content to just sit in that dusty old library with his dusty old books. He let his assets rot. Julian says it was practically financial malpractice. We're not destroying his legacy, we're finally making it worth something. We're taking his old-fashioned money and turning it into a real, modern fortune. And there it was, the final damning piece of evidence. It wasn't just about the money, it was about her contempt. Contempt for my father's intellect, for his values, for the quiet, thoughtful life he had led. She saw his legacy not as something to be honored, but as a provincial embarrassment to be liquidated and upgraded, like an old kitchen. The last flicker of hope inside me died, and the cold, clear certainty I'd felt in Arthur's office returned, this time for good. She had failed the test, spectacularly. "You're right, Sarah," I said, my voice now devoid of all warmth. "I see that now." "Good," she said, mollified. "I knew you'd come around. Now, if you'll excuse me, the demolition team is scheduled to be there tomorrow morning to clear the lot, and I want to be there to supervise." She hung up. I stood by the hotel window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. Demolition? The word echoed in the silent room. She wasn't just selling the house, she was erasing it from the face of the earth and taking my father's secret with it. My gaze drifted to the framed print on the hotel wall, some generic, soothing seascape. But I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing my father years ago, on my 16th birthday. He hadn't given me a car, like my mother had wanted. Instead, he'd taken me into the library and presented me with a small, ornate brass key. It wasn't a key to the house, but to the library's private entrance from his study. "This room is your inheritance, Genesis," he had told me, his voice soft but serious. Not the books themselves, but what they represent. A respect for knowledge, the patience to seek out the truth, the wisdom to know that the greatest assets we have are not the things we own, but the values we protect and the integrity with which we live. He had placed the key in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Promise me you will always be its guardian." I had made that promise, a solemn vow from a serious girl who didn't fully understand its weight. Now I did. This was never about a piece of real estate. It wasn't even about the $87 million. It was about that promise. It was about the difference between a house and a home, between an asset and a legacy, between old-fashioned money and a modern fortune built on air. My sister had made her choice. She had chosen the wrecking ball. I picked up the phone again and made a call of my own, not to Arthur, but to the discreet car service he had recommended. I gave them the address of my father's house. The time for waiting was over. My father had named me Genesis, a beginning, but tomorrow I would be the end. The morning was painfully beautiful, the kind of perfect California day that belongs on a postcard. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue. A mockingbird sang its complex song from the branches of the old oak tree my father had planted as a boy. The air was cool and smelled of dew-kissed roses from the neighbors' meticulously kept gardens. It was a morning of profound and serene peace, which made the ugly yellow excavator parked on our front lawn look like a sacrilege. Its steel claw rested on the grass, a mechanical vulture waiting to tear into the heart of my childhood. A small crew of men in hard hats stood by, drinking coffee from paper cups, their conversation a low murmur beneath the birdsong. And standing at the edge of the driveway, surveying the scene with the proprietary air of conquering heroes were Serafina and Julian. Sarah was dressed in expensive white athleisure wear, large sunglasses perched on her head, holding a venti-sized coffee cup like a scepter. Julian stood beside her, one hand on his hip, the other gesturing expansively toward the house as he spoke to the foreman. They were performing. This wasn't just a demolition for them, it was a coronation, the public unveiling of their new and improved lives. They looked so pleased with themselves, so utterly certain of their victory. I had the driver stop the anonymous rental car half a block away. I didn't want to announce my arrival. I wanted to observe. I sat for a long moment, watching them. The anger I had felt the night before, the hot, bitter rage, was gone. It had burned itself out, leaving something cold, clean, and incredibly focused in its place. I felt a surgeon's calm before a complex operation. I was no longer a participant in a family drama. I was an observer of a flawed system about to crash. Finally, I got out of the car. The quiet click of the door closing seemed to echo in the morning stillness. I wore a simple, dark blue sheath dress and low heels, the armor of a professional. My hair was pulled back neatly. I was not dressed for a fight. I was dressed for a final accounting. I walked toward them, my steps measured and even on the pavement. The foreman saw me first, his conversation with Julian trailing off. He gave me a curious look. Julian turned, and his smug smile froze on his face. He nudged Sarah, who turned, her own smile faltering, as she took in the sight of me. For a split second, I saw genuine shock in her eyes, a flicker of an emotion she couldn't control. Then, the mask of superiority snapped back into place. "Well, well," Sarah said, her voice dripping with amusement. She took a deliberate sip of her coffee. "Look what the cat dragged in. I didn't think you'd have the stomach to actually show up." Julian smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "Here to say your last goodbyes to the old pile of bricks, Genesis? Don't worry, we'll send you a picture of the fabulous high-rise we build in its place. Maybe we'll even name a conference room after you." They expected me to cry or to scream, to launch into a tirade of helpless, hysterical accusations. That was the role I had always played in our family's twisted little dramas. I did none of those things. I stopped a few feet from them, on the walkway my father had laid with his own hands. I didn't look at them. I looked at the house. I looked at the window of the library where he had taught me to read, at the front porch where we'd sat on summer evenings. I let their insults hang in the beautiful morning air, and I said nothing. My silence was a void, and it began to pull at them, to unnerve them. It wasn't the response their script had called for. "What?" Sarah finally snapped, her voice a little too sharp. "Nothing to say? Cat got your tongue, or did your precious computer forget how to speak?" I finally turned my gaze from the house and met her eyes. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt an immense, pitying distance. They had no idea what was coming. They were standing on a trap door, celebrating while my hand was on the lever. "Hello, Sarah, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly level. "It's a beautiful morning for a demolition, isn't it?" My calm greeting seemed to unsettle them more than any outburst could have. They exchanged a quick, confused look. Before they could formulate their next witty retort, a quiet, authoritative cough sounded from the street behind me. A gleaming black town car, the kind that whispers of old money and billable hours, had pulled up to the curb. The driver opened the rear door, and Arthur Vance emerged. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who knows he commands every room he enters. He was the personification of the establishment they so desperately wanted to join, and his unexpected presence on their little stage was a jarring anomaly. He walked toward us, carrying a slim leather briefcase. The demolition foreman, who had been watching our family drama with detached interest, straightened up, an instinctual show of respect for the power Arthur exuded. "Sarah, Julian," Arthur said, his voice pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge of formality. "I see you're preparing to begin." Julian, ever the sycophant in the presence of perceived wealth, puffed out his chest and extended a hand. "Mr. Vance, what a surprise to see you here. Julian Croft," he said, introducing himself as if Arthur hadn't been his father-in-law's attorney for 30 years. "Just overseeing the preliminary stages of our new development project." Arthur ignored the outstretched hand. He gave Julian a look of such mild, dismissive contempt that Julian's hand fell limply to his side. "A development project that is predicated on a number of significant legal and ethical breaches," Arthur stated, his pleasant tone never wavering. He turned his attention to the foreman, who now looked deeply uncomfortable. "Sir, what is your name?" Mike Jensen," the foreman stammered. "Well, Mr. Jensen," Arthur said, opening his briefcase and producing a crisp, official-looking document. "This is a cease and desist order, filed with the Superior Court of California an hour ago. It legally compels you and your crew to immediately halt any and all demolition activity on this property, pending an investigation into fraudulent conveyance and abuse of fiduciary duty." The legal terms hung in the air, complex and menacing. Mike Jensen's eyes went wide. He took the document from Arthur as if it were radioactive, his gaze scanning the official seals and intimidating paragraphs of text. Sarah let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Oh, this is rich. Genesis, did you really run to Daddy's old lawyer to try and stop us? It's not going to work. The sale is legal. The power of attorney is ironclad." "Is it?" Arthur replied, his voice still deceptively mild. He turned his gaze on her, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the shark that lurked beneath his courtly exterior. "A durable power of attorney for healthcare is intended to allow for medical decisions in a time of incapacitation. The use of that specific instrument to liquidate an estate asset of this magnitude for personal financial gain, without the explicit informed consent of the co-beneficiary, especially when that beneficiary was reachable and of sound mind, is not just unethical, Miss Albright. It is a textbook case for criminal prosecution." Julian's face had gone pale. The confident developer was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd just been told the IRS was on the phone. "Now hold on," he blustered, trying to regain his footing. "Our lawyer reviewed everything. It's all perfectly above board." "Then I'm sure your lawyer won't mind discussing it with the district attorney's office," Arthur said smoothly. "I took the liberty of forwarding them a copy of my preliminary findings this morning. They seemed very interested." This was the first blow, not a loud, emotional explosion, but a quiet, precise, legal maneuver that completely upended their narrative. The power they thought they held, the clever loophole they had exploited, was suddenly not a shield, but a cage they had built for themselves. The foreman, Mike Jensen, a man who just wanted to do his job and go home, folded the court order and tucked it into his back pocket. "All right, boys, pack it up," he called out to his crew, his voice full of weary resignation. "We're done here for today. Let the lawyers figure it out." He wouldn't even look at Sarah or Julian. In an instant, they had transformed from powerful clients into a toxic liability. As the crew began to shut down the excavator and collect their tools, the silence that fell was thick with humiliation. The stage for their triumph had become a scene of public defeat. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, the color draining from her face. Her victory had evaporated before the first brick had even been touched. As the rumble of the departing work trucks faded, leaving a stunned silence in its wake, I turned and walked toward the front door of the house. I still had the key my father had given me, but I didn't use it. The lock had been changed, of course it had. I rang the bell. The hollow chime echoed inside, a sound of profound emptiness. After a long moment, the door was unlatched by a nervous-looking real estate agent, a young woman in a blazer that was a size too big. She had clearly been expecting the demolition crew, not this quiet, funereal gathering. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting between me, Arthur, and the shell-shocked couple on the driveway. "I believe you are trespassing," Arthur said, his voice calm but firm. "This property is the subject of a legal dispute. I suggest you vacate the premises immediately." The agent blanched and practically fled, muttering apologies as she scurried to her car. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Arthur followed, but Sarah and Julian remained hesitating on the porch, as if the threshold had become an invisible barrier. Their authority had been stripped away, and they were no longer sure of their right to even enter. "What are you doing, Genesis?" Sarah finally asked, her voice a raw whisper. I didn't answer. I walked into the living room. The sight was a physical blow. It was a house, but it was no longer a home. It had been professionally staged for the sale, all traces of my parents' lives erased. Our comfortable, worn furniture was gone, replaced by generic, soulless rental pieces. The walls were bare, the nail holes from a lifetime of family photos spackled over and painted a sterile, impersonal gray. It was a ghost of a house, its memories professionally exorcised. My gaze scanned the empty room and landed on a single overlooked detail. In the corner, by the now empty fireplace, sat a large, slightly crushed cardboard box. It was overflowing with the detritus deemed too worthless to keep, too personal to stage, and too much trouble to transport. It was the box of things that get left behind. I walked over to it and knelt down. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, directed more to the contents of the box than to my sister. "Before you sold this empty shell, before you invited the bulldozers, did you even bother to look? Did you even take one last walk through?" I reached into the box. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of my grandfather's Purple Heart from his service in Korea. He had been a hero, a fact my father spoke of with immense, quiet pride. Beside it was a fragile, yellowed album of my parents' wedding photos. The black and white images filled with the joyful, hopeful faces of people I barely recognized. Underneath that was a bundled stack of my mother's letters to my father from when he was in graduate school, her elegant cursive full of love and longing. And near the bottom, a small velvet-lined box containing the silver baby cup that had been engraved with my name. I lifted the heavy metal. Its purple ribbon faded with age. "Grandpa's medal," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "He earned this for pulling 3 men from a burning vehicle. You were going to let this be thrown in a dumpster." I picked up the wedding album. "Mom and Dad's wedding, the day our family started?" My hand trembled as I lifted the bundle of letters. Their love story. Finally, I held up the silver cup. My story. I looked up at them then, my eyes burning. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face ashen. Julian hovered behind her, unable to meet my gaze. The confident bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly shame. This wasn't about the law. This wasn't about money. This was about a deeper, more profound crime. "You didn't just sell a house, Sarah," I said, my voice breaking with the weight of it all. "You sold them. You sold us. You put our entire history in a cardboard box and left it for the garbage collectors." I looked at Julian, my gaze like ice. "Tell me, Julian, in your $900,000 deal, what was the monetary value you assigned to all this? What's the market rate for a war hero's courage, or for 50 years of a marriage? I'm a numbers person. I'd really like to know." They had no answer. There was no answer. Their arrogant, forward-looking ambition had been revealed for what it was: a shallow, grasping greed, utterly blind to anything that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. In their rush to build their glorious future, they had proven they had no respect for the past, and in doing so, had forfeited any claim to the legacy they so desperately wanted to exploit. The smug smiles were gone. The moral high ground had crumbled to dust beneath their feet. I left them there in the hollowed-out living room, silenced by the weight of their own sacrilege. Without another word, I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing on the bare hardwood floors. Arthur followed, a silent, steady presence at my back. I could hear Sarah and Julian trailing behind us, drawn forward by a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible curiosity. I stopped at the entrance to my father's library. Even empty, the room held a palpable sense of peace and power. The afternoon sun streamed through the large bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden spirits. The walls were lined with empty shelves, a silent testament to the knowledge they had once held. It was here, in this room, that the final act would take place. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest. I felt my father's presence here more than anywhere else. I could almost hear his quiet voice, feel his calm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You said Dad was old-fashioned, Sarah," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. I didn't turn to look at her. "You said he had no vision. You were wrong. He had more vision than either of you could possibly comprehend. He just didn't feel the need to broadcast it." I walked to the west wall, to the built-in bookshelf that housed the complete, leather-bound works of William Shakespeare. My hand went unerringly to a specific volume, The Tempest, my father's favorite, a story of magic, betrayal, and ultimate justice. I didn't pull it out. Instead, I pushed it. There was a soft, satisfying click, a sound of old, well-oiled machinery engaging. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, hydraulic hiss that was utterly incongruous in the quiet, academic room, the entire bookcase began to retract into the wall. It moved slowly, majestically, revealing not plaster and wood, but a thick, impenetrable-looking door of brushed steel, complete with a digital keypad and a formidable-looking circular vault handle. A choked gasp came from behind me. It was Sarah. Julian just made a low, wounded sound, like the air being forced from his lungs. Their small, grubby $900,000 crime was being eclipsed by a secret so vast and cinematic it was beyond their wildest imaginings. The house they thought was just a pile of bricks had been a Trojan horse. I stepped up to the keypad and entered a sequence of numbers, not a birthday or an anniversary, but the accession number of my father's favorite manuscript at the Huntington Library. A small green light blinked on. I gripped the heavy steel handle and turned. The locking bolts withdrew with a series of deep, resonant thuds that echoed like a judgment in the silent room. I pulled the heavy door open. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, the carefully controlled atmosphere of a bank vault. Inside, the small windowless room was lined not with shelves, but with rows of locked metal file drawers and safety deposit boxes. In the center of the room, on a simple steel table, sat a single large, fireproof safe. "What is this?" Julian whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Arthur Vance stepped forward, moving past me into the vault. "This," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, "is the Richard C. Albright Legacy Trust. It is the physical nexus of your father's life's work." He had a key, and with my verbal permission, he opened the main safe. He began to remove documents, laying them out on the central table with the care of a museum curator handling priceless artifacts. "Your father believed in tangible assets," Arthur explained, his voice the only sound in the room. He placed a thick sheaf of stock certificates on the table. Original shares in a small company called Microsoft, and this one, a tech firm, specializing in microprocessors, Intel. He laid out another folder. Deeds to commercial properties in Austin, Texas, purchased in 1992. Another. A portfolio of municipal bonds, quietly accumulating tax-free interest for 30 years. And another. Statements from a numbered account at Credit Suisse in Zurich. With each document, another layer of my father's quiet genius was revealed. Sarah had sunk into the desk chair by the window, her face a mask of chalky disbelief. Julian leaned against the doorframe, his knees visibly weak, his eyes wide with a look of pure, agonized greed. He was a man watching a fleet of treasure galleons sail past just after he'd sold his only fishing boat for a handful of shells. Finally, Arthur placed the leather-bound portfolio I had seen in his office on top of the pile. He opened it to the final summary page, its single, stark number facing out into the room. As of the last quarterly statement, Arthur announced, his voice carrying the final, devastating weight of absolute truth. The total value of the trust to which Genesis is the sole beneficiary and trustee is $87,452,000. And change. The number fell into the silence. It wasn't just a number, it was a verdict. It was the full stop at the end of a long, sad story. Julian made a soft whimpering sound and slid down the doorframe to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. Serafina just stared, her eyes unfocused, at the wall of steel and secrets her father had built. The modern fortune she had been so proud of, the one built on her husband's bluster and her own betrayal, had been revealed as a pathetic little gamble. She had traded a kingdom for a handful of magic beans, and they had just turned to dust in her hand. The sound of her quiet, broken sobs was the only sound of victory I needed. The following 6 months were a study in quiet reconstruction. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, calm certainty. I did not return to Berlin immediately. There was work to be done, a legacy to understand and secure. The first thing I did was have the cheap rental furniture removed from the house. I found the old, familiar pieces my parents had loved in a storage unit Sarah had rented, and I had them moved back in. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to put our home back together, not just as it was, but as it should have been. The house began to breathe again. The final act of the drama took place not on a sun-drenched lawn, but where it had all begun, in the quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary of Arthur Vance's office. I sat in the same leather armchair, but I was not the same woman who had sat there half a year ago. The frantic, wounded uncertainty was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. Arthur slid a slim folder, across the polished expanse of his desk. "The final disposition," he said, his voice holding a note of quiet satisfaction. "I thought you should see it." I opened it. It was a summary of the consequences that had befallen Serafina and Julian, a neat, bullet-pointed list of a life dismantled. "As I suspected," Arthur began, steepling his fingers, "the so-called cash buyer for the house was a shell corporation, registered in Delaware to a holding company, owned by a trust that was, after my investigators, peeled back a few layers, controlled by Julian himself. It was a classic scam." He explained the mechanics of the crime with the passion of a historian detailing a failed military campaign. Julian's plan was never to develop the property. It was to use the fraudulent power of attorney to buy the $4 million house for a fraction of its value, then immediately use the doctored title to secure a multi-million-dollar loan against the property's true worth. He and Sarah would have pocketed the loan money and let the shell corporation default, leaving the bank to foreclose on a house they never truly owned. It was a scheme built on air, a modern fortune conjured from pure deceit. "Unfortunately for Mr. Croft," Arthur continued, a grim smile touching his lips, "when you involve federally insured banks and interstate wire transfers, you're no longer a local real estate hustler. You are a federal criminal." The words on the page in front of me were stark. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft. The U.S. Attorney's Office had taken the case with relish. Julian and Serafina were facing a federal indictment that carried a potential sentence of decades in prison. The legal punishment was only the beginning. The second page of the report detailed the financial fallout. The moment the investigation began, a federal judge had frozen all their assets, their accounts, their cars, the gaudy, overpriced house Julian had bought for Sarah. Everything was seized. The life of luxury they had built on credit and arrogance was revealed to be a house of cards. And the gentlest of legal breezes had blown it all away. They were, for all intents and purposes, destitute. "And Serafina?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "She has tried to contact you, I assume?" Arthur asked gently. I nodded. The calls had been a predictable, pathetic symphony in 3 movements. First came the rage. Voicemails filled with screamed accusations and threats, blaming me for ruining their lives. Then came the manipulation, tearful calls about how devastated our mother was, how I was tearing the family apart, how Dad would have wanted us to work it out. The final stage was the begging. In the last few weeks, the messages had become desperate, disjointed pleas. She'd leave rambling voicemails at 3 in the morning, her voice slurring, alternating between begging for money and crying for forgiveness. She promised she would pay it all back. She said she'd do anything. I never answered. I never listened to a single message all the way through. I blocked her numbers one by one. I had instructed Arthur that all communication was to go through his office. Her drama was no longer my own. Her chaos could no longer touch me. The truest punishment, I realized, was not the prison sentence they faced or the money they had lost. Their true punishment was that they had been revealed. Their entire lives had been a performance, a carefully curated image of success and effortless superiority. Now the curtain had been torn away, and everyone, their friends, their community, the world, could see them for what they were: cheap, desperate frauds. They had been so obsessed with what other people thought, and now what other people thought was their living nightmare. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. I felt no joy, no triumphant surge of revenge. I just felt quiet. the scales had been balanced. The system my father had believed in, a world of rules, of consequences, of actions having equal and opposite reactions, had worked. Justice, it turned out, was not a fiery passion. It was a cold, clean, and perfectly balanced equation. A year after I first stepped into Arthur Vance's office, I stood on a different kind of stage. It was a brightly lit auditorium at my old university, filled with the hopeful, intelligent faces of young students, academics, and a few notable figures from the tech world. The air buzzed with excitement and possibility. I was no longer a refugee from my own life. I was the architect of my future, and more importantly, the steward of my father's past. I stood at a polished wooden podium, a familiar academic setting that now felt like a second home. Behind me, a large screen displayed a simple, elegant logo, a stylized oak tree like the one in our front yard, its roots forming a complex, branching network that resembled a circuit board. Beneath it were the words, "The Richard C. Albright Foundation." My voice, when I began to speak, was clear and steady, amplified by the microphone, but grounded in a newfound, unshakable sense of self. My father, Richard Albright, was a history professor, I began, my gaze sweeping across the expectant faces. He believed that the best way to predict the future was to understand the past. He saw the long, sweeping arcs of human innovation, the patterns of progress, the moments when a single idea could change the world. He was a quiet man. He didn't seek the spotlight. He sought knowledge. I paused, letting the memory of him fill the space. He was also a brilliant investor, but he didn't invest in companies. He invested in ideas. He didn't chase trends. He chased potential. He believed that the greatest asset any society has is the untapped brilliance of its next generation. I had spent the last year not just managing a fortune, but transforming it. With Arthur's guidance and the help of a small, dedicated team, I had liquidated the disparate, arcane assets my father had so carefully accumulated and consolidated them. I had taken his quiet, private wealth and given it a public voice, a purpose that would echo far beyond our family's small, sad drama. My father believed that talent is universal, but opportunity is not, I continued. He knew that for every recognized genius, there are 1,000 more whose potential is extinguished by a lack of resources, by economic hardship, or by the simple, soul-crushing belief that their dreams are out of reach. I looked toward the front row, where Professor Alistair Finch sat, his aging face beaming with a pride that felt more paternal than any I had ever received from my own mother. It was his belief in me that had illuminated the path forward. That is why, today, I am honored to announce the official launch of the Albright Foundation and its inaugural initiative, the Genesis Grant. I smiled, allowing myself the small personal tribute. This grant will provide full 4-year scholarships and research funding for promising young women in the STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It is designed to find the women who are working late in the library, the ones coding in their dorm rooms, the ones who are told their passion is just a hobby, and give them the one thing my father believed was more valuable than any inheritance: a chance. The freedom to build, to create, to fail, and to succeed, entirely on their own terms. A wave of warm, sustained applause filled the auditorium. It wasn't for me or for the money. It was for the idea, an idea that resonated with the core values of everyone in that room: hard work, merit, and the belief in a better future. I shared a brief, warm memory of my father explaining the beauty of a mathematical proof, of how he taught me that logic could be a form of poetry. I never once mentioned Serafina or Julian or the ugly battle that had led to this moment. They were a footnote in a story that was now, finally, about something so much bigger. I had taken the legacy they had tried to desecrate and turned it into a monument they could never touch. I had transformed their greedy, grasping ambition into something that would actually build a future, not just for one family, but for generations of brilliant young women to come. As the applause faded, I felt a sense of peace that was more profound and satisfying than any victory. It was the feeling of a promise kept. I had become the guardian of my father's legacy, not by hoarding it, but by giving it away. I no longer live in my father's house, but I work there every day. The transformation is something I think he would have appreciated. The sterile gray paint is gone, replaced by warm, welcoming colors. The living room, once a stage for family dramas, is now a bright, open co-working space where brilliant young minds collaborate. The formal dining room, where I was so often made to feel small, is now a seminar room, its walls lined with whiteboards covered in complex equations. The house is no longer silent. It's filled with the low, energetic hum of quiet conversation, the clicking of keyboards, and the occasional, wonderful sound of a shared, intellectual laugh. It has become a home again, not for one family, but for a new kind of family, bound by curiosity and ambition. But the heart of the house remains untouched. The library is exactly as my father left it, a sanctuary of leather and paper and quiet contemplation. This is my office now. I sit at his old familiar desk, but I keep the vault behind the Shakespearean bookshelf permanently open. It serves as a constant reminder that the greatest treasures are the ones you use to build something new. This afternoon, the sun is streaming through the bay window, just as it always has, illuminating the dancing dust motes. From my desk, I can see a group of the first Genesis Grant recipients gathered around the large reading table. A young woman from rural Idaho, the first in her family to attend college, is passionately explaining her work in computational biology to another, a robotics prodigy from the inner city. They are not competing, they are connecting, their faces alive, with the sheer joy of being understood. I watch them, and the last stubborn knot of a lifetime of anger finally completely dissolves. I no longer feel any rage towards Serafina, no bitterness, no desire for retribution. I just feel a profound and quiet pity for what she will never understand. She and Julian thought a legacy was something you could seize, something you could liquidate and spend. They never grasped that a true legacy is something you earn, something you build, and something you give away. My father's inheritance wasn't the $87 million. That was just the raw material. His true inheritance was the faith he had in me, the values he instilled, and the quiet strength he knew I would one day find. The young woman from Idaho looks up and catches my eye. She gives me a small, shy, grateful smile. I smile back. In her and in all the young women who will pass through these halls, my father's legacy is alive and growing, multiplying in ways a stock portfolio never could. I learned a long time ago that you cannot choose the family you are born into. Blood is not a bond, it is just a biological fact. For years, I fought for a place at a table where I was never truly welcome. Now I understand. The goal isn't to find your place at someone else's table. The goal is to build your own. I turn back to my work, the quiet clicking of my own keyboard joining the gentle hum of the house. I am no longer looking back. For the first time in my life, I feel the boundless, peaceful expanse of the future opening up before me. The road ahead is clear, and it is entirely, wonderfully my own.